But I had to tell him the effect, the powerful effect that he had on a nation and on people, his people. And when I received this letter, I never believed I would hear from him or receive a letter, because I knew he was in hiding, and I knew people wanted to do away with him, and I never thought I would hear from him. And this is what he wrote. I was deeply touched by your letter and want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your warm words and thoughts. Like you, I too believe that the day is getting closer when the good Lord will do justice to the Romanian people. And I, like you, I strongly believe that all of us who care about that once marvelous corner of the world should do something to help him. I can probably understand more easily than other Americans your feeling that people living in freedom often take freedom for granted, like the air they breathe. Red Horizons tries to open a window for the American reader looking out on the incredible life at the court of any Soviet bloc leader. I have dedicated it to all political prisoners, kept hostage against their will, who are crying for help from the free world. Once again, I want to say that I was deeply moved by your letter, as well as by your strong belief in freedom. Thank you for taking the trouble of sharing your feelings with me, even without knowing if your letter would ever reach me. With kindest regards, Ion Mihai Pacepa.
This day will mark a new start for a man who has lived his life in the darkness of the Iron Curtain. He is a communist spy master who will, this day, come out of the cold.
That morning, as I looked out into the sun, I wondered again if I could actually go through with it. For some reason, it seemed brighter that day. As head of the Romanian espionage service, I knew my knowledge would be a valuable asset to the West, but it would also make me a highly wanted man by my Soviet masters. As I got closer to the U.S. Embassy, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. My mouth felt as if I had been freeze-dried. I knew that once I stepped through that door, there would be no going back. I would never again be able to return to the family, to the friends, or to the country I loved. But the darkness I had lived with for so long was eating away at my soul. I knew I must jump off this cliff, and I prayed I would land alive. And I still wondered, could I make this leap of faith?
Despite fear and deep reservations, Lieutenant General Ion Mihai Pacepa stepped into the U.S. Embassy and requested asylum. The CIA officer on duty was quick to understand the ramifications of such a defection. Under the cloak of night and high security, the highest-ranking Soviet bloc official ever to defect to the West was secretly whisked out of Germany. Although the price he paid for defecting was high, with a $2 million bounty on his head, multiple assassination attempts on his life, and is still hiding to this day, Lieutenant General Ion Mihai Pacepa is now speaking out. This is the true story of one man and the truth he revealed to the free world. The truth of a highly secret strategy called disinformation, an insidious formula to undermine and destroy Western civilization, a strategy still at work today. Prepare yourself for an eye-opening revelation as we unravel the world of disinformation.
Disinformation is a kernel of truth around which you weave a tissue of falsehoods.
And that twist with a lie is disinformation.
People have manipulated. The media is manipulated and manipulating.
This informer has no respect for means.
Disinformation has a very long-term strategic objective.
An influence campaign to influence American attitudes, to influence public opinion.
Disinformation appears to come from a trusted source.
A lie buys a government.
Disinformation flows from the delusion
that you can change the world. Very sinister.
The disinformation has been going on for years and years.
If you can get the New York Times to release your misinformation, it becomes disinformation.
It's deceptive, it's disgusting, it's despicable, and it's part of their political program.
It's part of an overall strategy.
We see disinformation as a way to sidestep us, particularly in the intelligence world.
Disinformation has been part of the art of war going back to ancient times.
Disinformation is pervasive. It's pervasive in our society and in our culture.
It's a form of psychological warfare.
Born in Bucharest, Romania in the fall of 1928, young Mihai Pacepa grew up an only child of two rather different but loving parents. His devoted father was a workaholic who carved out a career repairing cars. Though he put no belief in God, he had a strong ethical knowledge of right and wrong and instilled that in his son. Mihai's mother loved her husband, and as a woman of faith, she prayed for him daily. Her moral worldview in a right and just Christian God was ingrained in her son from an early age, a seed of compassion that would someday bear fruit. The young Pacepa also learned a love for music and art, and at the age of 9, he could play Beethoven's difficult Kreutzer Sonata on his violin.
Pacepa was the highest-ranking defector of the Cold War then and still.
He's a remarkable man. That is one of the great acting jobs in human history, to have already begun decades before your internal migration away from the belief system of Romanian Communist Party, and to carry on with your job in such a way as to acquire a great deal of information that was useful to the West, and it was very useful. He was the most senior intelligence defector that we had during the Cold War as head of Romanian intelligence. And for years before that, he was very senior and was in a lot of the meetings at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. So he's a fascinating individual and a brave man.
Witnesses like General Pacepa are very important to our defense of ourselves.
My father's lifelong dream had been to go to America. He spent most of his career working at the Bucharest affiliate of General Motors, and he was firmly determined that one day he would gather up his family and immigrate to Detroit. Trapped by the war and then by the Soviet occupation, he was forced to give up that dream, but not before passing his love for America along to me. The moment that the United States reopened its embassy after the war, I became one of its enthusiastic visitors. I didn't realize that it would be 33 years before I would fulfill my father's dream.
Pacepa was born into a world on the brink of disaster and tremendous upheaval. In the impoverished country of Germany, a charismatic leader and his nationalist party were gaining power. And in Russia, a man who would become the greatest mass murderer in history was solidifying his iron rule. The war to end all wars had ushered in the age of totalitarianism and would bring about the most heinous genocides of modern history. As a boy, Mihai knew nothing of the growing cancer called communism that would someday consume his world and nearly destroy his life. Communism had been born in the mind of Karl Marx, and in 1917, it became a nightmare on earth in Russia. The release in 1848 of the Communist Manifesto, the most famous pamphlet in the history of the world, would usher in a new religion, a religion based on man as God and government as deliverer.
These great or terrible messianic movements, Nazism, communism, socialism, all appear after Darwin. They appear when organized religion declines. People need a meaning in their lives, and these are substitutes for religion. And what makes them so dangerous, because they believe they can establish the kingdom of heaven in this world. And they will do anything that it takes to achieve that. And of course, if you believe that you lead mankind into the Garden of Eden, what crime wouldn't you commit and what lie wouldn't you tell to do it? And if you don't go along with the program, we're going to put you in a gulag, or we're going to put you up against a wall and shoot you. And that's the morality of the left, that there's nothing more dangerous than people who can fear God.
The communist doctrine, put to use by Vladimir Lenin, was taken to a new level of terror and fraud by Joseph Stalin. The result, an international ideology that snuffed out the lives of over 150 million people in the 20th century, twice the combined death toll of the two world wars. Vladimir Lenin infamously stated that the only morality that his Bolsheviks recognized was that which furthered their interests. This meant that lying was fully justified and that any target was legitimate. Russia became the first major power to make deception a permanent national policy. That deception included propaganda and the uniquely Soviet tactic of disinformation. But how is disinformation different and so much more insidious than other forms of political deception? Disinformation is a lie spread not by the liar, but by another source, by a legitimate source that many believe in. This makes it not only harder to discern, but can give it an often endless life of its own. The lie thus becomes a rewritten history. For example, if during the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union put out a story that American soldiers were carrying out atrocities reminiscent of Genghis Khan, the free world would recognize that as misinformation or propaganda. But if a U.S. soldier were to spread that and a newspaper carry it, then many citizens might believe the slander and question America's involvement. Since World War II, disinformation has been the Kremlin's most effective secret weapon in its war on the West. Stalin turned the practice into a science deeply rooted in Russia's soil and history. Born in the 18th century, disinformation was the fruit of the passionate love affair between Catherine the Great and Prince Potemkin, her principal political and military advisor. In 1787, Potemkin took the Empress on a tour of the Crimea, which he had been instrumental in annexing from the Turks. In order to impress her, Potemkin had arranged for fake villages to be erected along the route that Catherine would take. Down through the ages, everyone who has sat on the Kremlin throne has utilized disinformation to transform his country into a monument to himself. Controlling all expressions of religion was central to that ambition. This manipulation of religion dates back to the 16th century, when Ivan the Terrible had himself crowned as Russia's first Tsar, as well as head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Russia's manipulation and persecution of religion came to an apex with the creation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, perhaps the most resilient piece of disinformation ever compiled.
This book purports to be the words of psychopathic Jewish world leaders that are conspiring to enslave the entire world.
The Tsarists, who were anti-Semites to a fault, engineered the fabrication of a document they called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for the purpose of sustaining one of the grounds for hating the Jews and engaging in pogroms against them, namely that they ran the world. And it is an extraordinary piece of work, not only because of the use that the Tsarists and those in Russia made of it, but the application of it to this very day by people who continue to find it useful for discrediting or undermining or justifying assaults against the Jews.
Judaism gave us the rule of law, comes out of the Sinai, and it's one of the reasons I think that anti-Semitism is always one of the first refuges of the scoundrels. They need to undermine that idea that the law is above the ruler. And one way they do that is to go after Jews and Judaism.
I'm just describing as a student of Soviet ideology. I know what I'm talking about. It started under Stalin. It got enhanced under Nikita Khrushchev. And obviously anti-Zionism became a fundamental underpinning of the Soviet ideology.
Soon after Lenin died in 1924, Stalin revived the protocols and made it the basis for his anti-Semitic purges. Over 7 million Russians were framed as Zionist spies and executed at Stalin's order. In Germany, Hitler used the protocols to blame the Jews for all of the disasters that had befallen the country. The Nazis translated the protocols into many new languages and flooded the world with them to create the impression of a Jewish conspiracy aimed at world domination, thus justifying the persecution of Jews as a matter of self-defense.
If you read some of the documents of the Nazis and newspapers of the Nazis and so on, you will see that they consider the protocols, Hitler himself considered the protocols to be a historical evidence for their anti-Semitic fantasies.
The use of disinformation to promote anti-Semitism did not, however, end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. In the late 1960s, KGB chief Yuri Andropov gave the protocols a new life.
Disinformation became a national policy. More people in the Soviet bloc worked for the disinformation machinery than for the Soviet army and defense industry put together. The bloc's intelligence community alone had well over 1 million officers and several million informants around the world. All were involved in deceiving the West, as well as their own people.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
President Ronald Reagan shocked people when he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. But it was evil. And the disinformation operation of its KGB and the whole intelligence apparatus was a key part of advancing that evil agenda.
Basically, the Soviet government, it was extremely successful in brainwashing millions and millions of people.
On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and set the world at war once again. 16 days later, Russia invaded Poland from the east in accordance with a secret protocol in the pact between Stalin and Hitler. This non-aggression agreement also gave Stalin the right to take parts of Romania and other parts of the Baltic. Without warning, on June 22, 1941, Germany terminated the pact and invaded the Soviet Union. Stalin's trust in Hitler cost Russia dearly. He even ignored intelligence warnings that Germany was likely to attack, believing such reports to be disinformation. Within 6 months, the Soviet military had suffered 4.3 million casualties, and Germany had captured 3 million Soviet prisoners. Although it was the most dedicated ally of Germany, Romania eventually turned to the Allied side. On August 23, 1944, just as the Red Army was penetrating the Moldavian front, King Michael led a successful coup to depose the Antonescu dictatorship. This resulted in a split of the country between those that still supported Germany and those that supported the new government.
Many in Romania had been fooled by Hitler, his propaganda, his disinformation. But my father, we could see him for what he was. I learned then to hate dictators. When Romania joined the Allies at the age of 16, I found myself fighting the Germans with a gun in my hands. 4 years of war squeezed Romania like a sponge, and what little remained had been stolen by the Soviet army. Despite the war, I finished high school, and in 1947 was number 3 on the list of students admitted to the Polytechnica University of Bucharest. With the war over, I thought the nightmare had ended. Little did I know what was ahead for me and my country.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The Communist parties, or fifth columns, constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization.
Churchill's Fulton speech of 1946, which actually finally made America and Britain recognize that there is ideological war, whether they want it or not, and they deliberately accepted this fact and started to fight this war.
Following the war, Russia held the upper hand as the Red Army occupied and held much of Eastern Europe with a military 3 times greater than the Allied forces in the West. Yet, at the Yalta Conference, as part of the Big Three, Stalin agreed that all liberated European and former Axis satellite countries would hold free elections. Soviet Minister Molotov expressed worry that the Yalta Agreement's wording might impede Russia's plans. Stalin responded, "Never mind. We'll do it our own way later." Stalin knew he had another secret disinformation weapon in his arsenal, a tactic called framing. Many believe that the worst damage from Soviet intelligence operations against the West has been the theft of highly classified secrets. In actuality, the worst and often irreparable damage done to the free world has been caused by the Kremlin's disinformation operations, designed to change the past. In KGB jargon, changing people's pasts was called framing, and it was a highly classified disinformation specialty. Both Lenin and Stalin successfully purged millions of rivals, opponents, and uncooperative citizens by framing them as traitors or Zionist spies. In 1945, Stalin decided to use his disinformation machine to take control of Eastern Europe. Nazi sympathizers were considered the most vile people at that time, and to be framed as such meant to be ostracized, arrested, or to be sentenced to death. Stalin used this black art of framing on numerous innocents.
I saw as Romania's heroic King Michael was framed as a Nazi collaborator and Western spy and forced to abdicate. Within just a few years, virtually the entire Romanian economy was running on stolen property. With control of the media, the government launched powerful disinformation offensives to persuade everyone that Romania could be changed into a prosperous country just by confiscating others' wealth.
And Romania was supposed to be an Allied control after 1945. Why was that so much free hand given to Stalin? That's my acquisition.
The Sovietization of Eastern Europe was accomplished by the Kremlin through subversive framing operations. All the initial leaders of the Eastern European countries were absolute nobodies, some even criminals, but all swore loyalty to the Kremlin's religion, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. The Soviet disinformation machinery thus framed the useful ones as national heroes, and the anti-communists became Nazis.
Huge crowds such as these shown here gather in the square before St. Peter's in Rome, where His Holiness Pope Pius XII speaks to them. This year, 400,000 listened intently to his solemn Easter message. In it, he warned the world that a time of serious crisis is at hand, and gravely cautioned his listeners against red factions who would seize power in Italy and deny Christianity its right to exist.
He despised the notion of communism, and he despised the notion of godless countries. And so he was the enemy, the supreme enemy.
He knew what communism meant, and it brought the church to its knees wherever it was, brought people to their knees.
For Stalin's plan to succeed, he knew he must destroy one of his greatest enemies. The church within those countries was his next target. The war between communism and the Catholic Church is almost as old as communism itself. In Russia, Lenin killed thousands of priests and closed most churches to make Marxism-Leninism the country's sole religion.
Most Americans and most people in the Western world do not understand what communism is about. Communism is first, way before economic system, is a religion. It has a God. His name is Lenin. It has a church. Its name is the Communist Party of the USSR. It has its prophets, it has its rituals, it has its texts, it has the Bible, it has everything. Lenin is in you, Lenin is in me, Lenin is everywhere. So just substitute Jesus or God and you'll understand where it comes from. They stole everything from Judaism, actually. So I believed in my God. Lenin was the most important hero, the most important person in my childhood. I was willing to inform on my parents. I was a good patriot. I was willing to die to destroy imperialism in America.
On June 3, 1945, Radio Moscow proclaimed that the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Pius XII, had been Hitler's pope, insinuating that he had been an ally of the Nazis during World War II. This was the first salvo of a calculated operation designed to smear the reigning pope in the eyes of the world. Radio Moscow's insinuation fell flat as a pancake. Churchill called him the greatest man of our time, and Albert Einstein wrote, "Before I had not been interested in the church, but today I felt a great admiration for the church, which alone has had the courage to stand against the Hitlerian onslaught on liberty." In the 1960s, the Kremlin tried again with a new generation. Central to that framing effort codenamed Operation C-12, was the 1963 theatrical play The Deputy, written by the leftist German playwright Rolf Hackut. It had the KGB's hands all over it, and it proceeded to promote the idea that Pius XII was Hitler's pope.
If you plug in, it's not just the play, but it's the whole Soviet disinformation mechanism behind the play that's promoting the play, doing books about the play, having the play translated and produced, and making kids in high school in the Soviet Union and other satellite nations go see it each year.
This man is in ground zero in Rome, surrounded by hostile forces.
No one seriously doubted where the Pope stood during the war. This all came up afterwards, after the Soviet plot came in, beginning in 1963, with the play The Deputy.
They used the network of the Roman Catholic Church to save Jewish lives.
Every rectory, every convent, every school throughout Rome became a sanctuary for Jews. In Rome, they saved about 8,000 Jews that way, and had one of the highest percentages of anywhere people being saved. There are a lot of testimony from Jewish people who say, you know, I was there, or my relatives were there.
The Concordat that was signed with Germany enabled the church to save converted Jews. He was infiltrated by spies and still managed to save Jewish lives, which were not part of his flock. How the world came to change its opinion of him is outrageous. The Valkyrie attempt on Hitler's life, 1944. We have the documents of the Kaltenbrunner report. It names Pacelli and his secretary Lieber as co-conspirators. Why? Because they were. They actually said that they would not interfere to negotiate a peace unless Hitler was dead.
He was hailed at the liberation of Rome, at the end of the war, at the time of his death in 1958. There are letters that the Holy See was inundated with letters and tributes and thanks and stuff, and everyone, and that's 1958. By 1963, he's a villain. How does that happen? Well, it happens because it was an orchestrated campaign.
In January 1951, just before I was about to graduate from college, I was drafted and became an officer of Romania's political police, the Securitate. At 22 years old, my whole life had suddenly been turned upside down. At the time, I really knew nothing about the Securitate. I was a chemical engineer. My father once told me that if I wanted to be different, I had to be strong enough to remain different to the end and not back down. But the moment I needed to be strong enough, I wasn't. Thus began a 28-year nightmare. During those early years, I could see night after night security officers being sent out to arrest people whose names were changed to numbers and who were then buried in jails or concentration camps. They were made to disappear from a society that they or their parents or their children dared to criticize. I was not involved in these operations, but I could see how socialism was built. Behind a daily propaganda, behind secret decrees and show trials, and often sentences without trials. A system that nullified elementary justice and human rights.
I discovered over the years, it's impossible for Americans to really get it. It's not anything that you can imagine.
When you were arrested as dissident in the Soviet Union and were under interrogation, for about 1 year, you would be totally isolated, completely. Neither your lawyer nor one else would have access to you. Only KGB. So why it was so? Because the KGB would try to use this isolation to provide to you a lot of disinformation, as they would smuggle false messages and information to them, saying that their wife who betrayed them, you know, and wasn't faithful for them. So they would use all such nasty tricks, you know. It's all part of disinformation. Why they would do it? They want to break your will, you know. They want you to give up while you are under interrogation.
Lenin originated a new disinformation program in 1902. He created a number of mass organizations intended for wide membership and which, therefore, can be as loose and as public as possible.
In order, however, to appeal to much larger audiences, they created front organizations.
Headquartered outside of Russia and pretending to be independent international entities, these tentacles of Soviet power grew into homegrown disinformation efforts that still haunt us today.
Organizations that had as their mission to conquer the minds in the West, but not in a direct way like the communist parties.
When I was granted political asylum in the USA, I found out that most people in American intelligence, the military, and the media did not even know what disinformation really meant. Because of that, few outsiders knew how these front organizations operated, or that they were in fact disinformation outlets, financed and managed by the KGB community. Even fewer know that this immense machinery is still alive today.
The smart leaders would not allow on their platforms people who would mess with the front group message. The long-term goal is to create a communist United States. But they wouldn't allow into their literature or on their platforms people calling for a communist United States because they want as broad, they want to suck in as broad a group as possible.
In 1949, the most influential such group was founded and given the respectable name of the World Peace Council. Its mission was to prove that the U.S. was a warmongering Zionist country financed by Jewish money and run by a greedy Council of the Elders of Zion.
And one of the magnets to attract, via disinformation, supporters for these fronts was peace.
In the 1970s, all WPC national branches initiated demonstrations against the American war in Vietnam. An international appeal in typically Soviet-style language issued by the World Peace Council called upon the people of the world to organize unprecedented mobilizations against American imperialism.
The World Peace Council was a very big organization, and it seemed international. We knew it was a cover organization for the Soviet Union and part of the propaganda machine.
With the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, Moscow newspapers reported the World Peace Council had received policy guidance and 90% of its funding from the Kremlin. Over the years, the Soviet-affiliated World Workers' Party created several front organizations such as ANSWER. ANSWER has helped to organize many of the largest anti-war demonstrations in the United States, including demonstrations of hundreds of thousands against the war in Iraq.
If you say that you want America to lose the Cold War, or you think that the attacks of 9/11 were justified, or that you want a revolution in America, you'll isolate yourself. So leftists never say what their agendas are. They tell you that they're for peace. We have these anti-war movements, which are nothing of the sort. The last big anti-war movement was about the war in Iraq. It wasn't an anti-war movement. It wasn't a peace movement. There was never a demonstration in front of the Iraqi embassy calling on Saddam Hussein to obey the 16 and then 17 UN resolutions to honor the truce he had signed in the Gulf War, which is what the conflict with Iraq was about. Not a single demonstration. All the demonstrations were attacks on America. The anti-war movement is the hate America left. That's what it is. And a lot of well-meaning people who are duped into thinking that this is really a peace demonstration.
Most believe that disinformation is an obsolete Cold War phenomena, but the continued life and growth of many front groups shows that belief to be disinformation.
Many front groups also began as part of a liberation movement against imperialist governments and bourgeois religions. These revolutionary movements were often secretly organized, infiltrated, and sponsored by the KGB, and worked from directives dictated by Moscow. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the National Liberation Army of Bolivia, the National Liberation Army of Colombia, the Secret Army for Liberation of Armenia, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine are but a few of the liberation groups that have terrorized the world and outlived their KGB creators. In 1961, the Kremlin opened another front in their war on religion by secretly infiltrating the World Council of Churches. From its beginning, Marxism itself was a religion that could coexist with no other, and in a basic sense, reads like a Christian heresy. In traditional Christianity, the glorifying of human nature takes place because of Christ's incarnation. In Marxism, the state takes Christ's place. Marxism even offers a theory of sin and salvation, with private property as the sin and collective ownership the salvation. As such, the state becomes a church that dispenses grace.
ACLU has done a lot of damage to this country. I think taking off the 10 Commandments out of every high school in America is horrible. I mean, I ask my people once in a while, tell me, is America better off today with Christianity in the corner, pushed down?
Building on one small truth, that God cares about the poor, the Kremlin invented liberation theology, one of the greatest disinformation campaigns against Christianity. Liberation theology proposes to combine the teachings of Jesus with the teachings of Marx as a way of justifying violent revolution to overthrow capitalism, thus becoming a version of Christianity that seems to endorse socialism. By the late 1960s, the WCC had essentially abandoned traditional Christian beliefs and instead focused on political and economic liberation. The WCC and eventually the National Council of Churches came under the authority of the International Department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and received most of their funding from the Soviet Peace Fund. In March of 2008, liberation theology came front and center in America.
No, 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 not God bless America, God damn America.
The whole world watched in disbelief as the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, the spiritual advisor of Senator Obama, screamed at the television screen. He accused the United States of America of deliberately spreading the AIDS sickness to kill black people. He insinuated that America had actually brought about the 9/11 attacks with its own terrorism.
The Democrats' damage control machinery simply brushed away Wright's statement, calling it a staple of black churches. But no, it was created years ago by the KGB disinformation machinery. I have good reason to believe that the Democratic Party's tolerance of such is the result of that party's growing tendency to swallow disinformation operations and to give them American cover.
In the 1950s, the FBI produced a 100-plus page classified report on the subject of communist campaigns. The Bureau defined campaigns as concentrated, continuous, and concerted succession of agitation and propaganda activities, specifically devised and timed to sway public opinion. All communist campaigns are intended to arouse, influence, and mobilize as many people as possible to further communist goals. That end goal, to ensure the triumph of Soviet power in the United States. The communists excelled at such disinformation campaigns. Operation Abolition was probably the most successful, as it worked to discredit and abolish the House Committee on Un-American Activities investigations. They framed their accusers as fascists, Nazis, and even racists who were allegedly unfairly hounding and maligning people by investigating their ties to Moscow.
Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
America's liberals and progressives, led by the ACLU, came together to find their demon not in the pro-communists who defended Stalin as he murdered tens of millions, but in the anti-communists who tried to tell the truth about Stalin, his murderous state, and his secret supporters in America. Of special interest and engaged in this campaign was Frank Marshall Davis, a card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. Still today, the likes of Davis himself continue to be protected by liberals who portray him as an innocent civil rights crusader, hounded by the McCarthyites. In the 1970s, he would go on to mentor a young Hawaiian boy named Barack Obama. The disinformation curiously continues.
One of the characteristics of disinformation is perversity. The goal is everything, and the means, whatever means can be used, they will be used.
President Truman announces an atomic explosion detected somewhere in Russia.
By the end of 1949, the international stage had shifted into Stalin's favor. In August of that year, Russia's first atomic bomb had successfully detonated. And in October, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The new global alliance between the two countries gave Stalin greater confidence, and he approved North Korea's secret plans for invasion.
A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard, they were all but overwhelmed until the United Nations took its historic vote to intervene.
The Cold War had become hot. But before it had ended, Stalin was gone. March 1953, the Soviet Union mourns the death of Stalin. For almost 3 decades, he had ruled supreme. Now they must learn to carry on without him.
At that time, I was already a Soviet bloc intelligence officer. but I was not yet aware that a Soviet leader's image was so important that he would go to any lengths, even to the point of killing and imprisoning millions, rewriting history, destroying institutions, manipulating religion, and changing traditions, all in developing his cult of personality. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, began his reign by executing the whole leadership of Stalin's political police as traitors. The chief Soviet intelligence advisor to Romania, General Alexander Sakharovsky, was appointed to head foreign intelligence in Moscow. In Romania, he had been my de facto boss, and so fate brought me into Khrushchev's inner circle. As I would be pushed to the top of Romania's foreign intelligence, I would learn of some of Khrushchev's most important foreign political projects.
Nikita Khrushchev was certainly the most controversial Soviet to reign in the Kremlin. In a disinformation operation called The Secret Speech, he unmasked Stalin's crimes. But his hands were far from clean. Khrushchev's close association with Stalin's Great Purge made him aware of what political crime could accomplish. The practice of resorting to political assassinations remained with Khrushchev, and he made it a main instrument of his own foreign policy.
Many times I heard Khrushchev say, both when he was sober and when he was drunk, that Stalin had made one inexcusable mistake. He had turned his political police against the Soviet Union's own people. Our enemies were not in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev would explain. America's millionaires were the ones who were determined to wipe communism off the face of the earth. They were our deadly enemies. They were the rabid dogs of imperialism.
The Marxist movements that have occurred in Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean, Cuba specifically, were all part of Russia's plan to dominate our hemisphere and ultimately encroach on the security of the United States.
I was made chief of a new department for science and technology in 1959. I was happy with my new job and still believed I could help my native country. I had with my own ears heard Khrushchev say, "Stealing from capitalism is moral, comrades. Stealing from our enemy is our duty." And for many years after that I heard Ceausescu saying the same thing, that stealing from capitalism was a Marxist duty. Both Khrushchev and Ceausescu rose to lead their countries without ever having earned a single penny in any productive job. Neither man had the slightest idea about what made an economy work, and each believed that stealing from the rich was the magic wand that would cure economic ills.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
In the mid or late 1950s, the Soviet bloc intelligence services were ordered to recruit American servicemen. We found that sergeants were much more accessible than higher-ranking officers. What you would call loose women were used as spotters at bars and nightclubs located near U.S. bases in Germany and Japan. Many of these sergeants, as we called them, were able to provide excellent information if given the right guidance.
Lee Harvey Oswald was an American serviceman stationed at a top-secret U-2 airbase in Japan in 1957. As a Marine Corps radar operator, Oswald possessed clues to the flight altitude of the high-flying spy plane. It was no coincidence, therefore, that the Soviet Union shot down a U-2 in May of 1960. He had an unusual fascination of Marxism, so at the end of his duty in Japan, Oswald decided to live in the workers' paradise. In October of 1959, he defected to the Soviet Union and remained there for 3 years.
During this time, Oswald was intensively indoctrinated, trained in agent communications and weaponry, given a Soviet wife who was trained to assist him, and then dispatched off to Texas.
From the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, Kennedy earned the KGB codename Pig. Bolstered by that failure, Khrushchev decided to bully the president and force the Americans to give up West Berlin. He thought Kennedy was a willing dupe. But Kennedy proved otherwise.
The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin. For the choice of peace or war is largely theirs, not ours.
In August of 1961, Khrushchev ordered the construction of a wall to end the exodus of East Berliners to the west. In response, Kennedy ordered the mobilization of forces in West Berlin. By October 27th, Soviet and American tanks stood 100 meters apart on either side of the checkpoint. The Berlin crisis of 1961 ended peacefully the next day, following a Soviet understanding to withdraw tanks. Kennedy had shown that neither he nor the free world would back down from Khrushchev.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
In May of 1962, Khrushchev decided to secretly deploy more than 50,000 Soviet troops to Cuba, along with nuclear-tipped missiles that could threaten Washington and New York. On October 14th, a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft shot photos over Cuba clearly showing construction sites for medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles. Thus began a 13-day confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States that could end in a nuclear holocaust.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
After rejecting advice from several fronts for an airstrike and full invasion, Kennedy settled on a naval blockade or quarantine of ships into Cuba. As Russian ships drew closer to the line of U.S. naval vessels, the spark that could set off a war was set. October 22, 1962, for the first time in its history, America's Strategic Air Command went to Defensive Condition 2. The next step, DEFCON 1, the cocked pistol for nuclear war. On the morning of October 28th, a new message from Khrushchev was broadcast on Radio Moscow.
The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
Once again, Kennedy checkmated Khrushchev. The missiles were removed. The top Soviet leadership took the Cuban outcome as a blow to its prestige, bordering on humiliation.
I heard from my superiors in the Romanian intelligence who thought Khrushchev intended to kill JFK. When the leader of communist Romania returned from a trip to Moscow, he said that the lunatic Khrushchev is so furious at Kennedy, and he's ready to tear him limb from limb with his bare teeth. He called Kennedy an arrogant millionaire and a warmongering fanatic, manipulated by the CIA. Today, people remember Khrushchev as a down-to-earth peasant who corrected the evils of Stalin, but he wasn't. The Khrushchev I knew was a compulsive political chatterbox who had no objective appreciation of facts and who had gotten a taste for the simple criminal solution because of his close association with Stalin's mass killings.
It is well known that Stalin and Khrushchev both dispatched assassins to the West. In the late 1930s, Stalin called for the head of his former colleague, Leon Trotsky. As history records, Trotsky was killed with an ice axe in Mexico. Khrushchev's assassination exploits were later exposed in the case of Bogdan Stashinsky, who confessed to a West German court that he had assassinated two enemies of the Soviet Union on Khrushchev's orders.
A dark page in the annals of America has been written to the crack of an assassin's bullet. A nation mourns, the world grieves. The man who became 35th president less than 3 years ago is dead. His life crushed like his wife's abandoned bouquet.
Did the Kremlin order a hit on President John F. Kennedy in 1962? The Berlin and Cuban missile crises had humiliated Khrushchev. And as he was losing power, he could have sought to liquidate the individual he blamed for his decline. There is no doubt he had a motive. In Oswald, he may have found the means. Pacepa's 2007 book detailed the worldwide disinformation operation by the KGB to divert the attention away from Moscow.
All Soviet bloc espionage services were identically organized and had identical methods of operation. These operations can easily be identified by their particular patterns, if you're familiar with them. The case of Lee Harvey Oswald shows a KGB pattern. It was a standard practice for an agent to carry a fake diary as part of his legend. Oswald had such a diary. Another standard practice was to pair recruited American agents with wives from Soviet bloc countries, so that the wives could keep watch on them. As you know, Oswald returned to the United States with a Russian wife. On November 26, 1963, just 4 days after President Kennedy was killed, General Sarkovsky, Moscow spy chief, landed unannounced in Bucharest. From him, we learned that the KGB had already launched a worldwide disinformation operation aimed at diverting public attention away from Moscow and toward the CIA. Khrushchev was afraid that if the American media and public opinion should start pointing their finger at Moscow, it could end in a nuclear confrontation. It was crucial, Sarkovsky emphasized, to spread our version about the assassination before Washington could spread its own, so that our disinformation machinery could plant the idea on virgin soil.
Codenamed Operation Dragon, it has become one of the most successful disinformation operations in contemporary history. Blaming the CIA for the KGB's own assassinations and kidnappings abroad was a disinformation tactic that had been introduced by Khrushchev. It essentially killed two birds with one stone. The CIA is by far the world's best intelligence organization. It decisively contributed to the Cold War victory, and it became the world's first line of defense against terrorism and nuclear proliferation. By portraying it as a criminal organization, the KGB hoped to diminish its ability to recruit human assets. To add more fuel, the official Soviet line spread on Oswald was he never was trusted during his stay in Russia and was suspected of being a CIA agent.
A very clever master of deception, Yuri Andropov, once told me, if a good piece of this information is repeated over and over, after a while it will take on a life of its own and will all by itself generate a horde of unwitting but passionate advocates.
The greatest and grandest of all conspiracy theories was born, and it has never stopped. Numerous books have been written and films made about the assassination of Kennedy. Public opinion polls have consistently shown that a majority of Americans believed there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. The first piece of irrefutable evidence proving that the KGB had launched a disinformation offensive was released by Boris Yeltsin. In his memoir, The Struggle for Russia, Yeltsin revealed a letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union dated November 23, 1963, the day after the assassination. Signed by the KGB chairman, the letter recommended publishing in a progressive paper in one of the Western countries an article exposing the attempt by reactionary circles in the USA to remove the responsibility for the murder of Kennedy from the real criminals, those being the racists and ultra-right elements guilty of the spread and growth of violence and terror in the United States. 2 months later, R. Palm Dutt, the editor of a communist-controlled British journal, Labour Monthly, published an article that raised the specter of CIA involvement without offering a scintilla of evidence.
In 1992, the British smuggled Vasily Metrokin, a KGB archivist, out of the Soviet Union along with some 25,000 highly classified copies from the KGB archives. Those documents represented just a minuscule part of the whole KGB archive. But nevertheless, the FBI described that archive as the most complete and extensive intelligence ever received from any source. The biggest counterintelligence bonanza of the post-war period.
Among the most important revelations provided by the archive are the highly classified KGB documents, proving that the Kennedy assassination conspiracy was born in and partially funded by the KGB. The documents reveal that the first book on the assassination, Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy, was authored by a former member of the German Communist Party and published in New York by a KGB agent who received subsidies totaling $672,000 from the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It is noteworthy that the book saw the light of day before the Warren Commission report was published. It also follows the Dragon Operation guidelines by describing Oswald as an FBI agent with a CIA background, who was used to shield the real assassins, a group of American right-wing conspirators. In 1988, New Orleans attorney Jim Garrison's book, On the Trail of the Assassins, claimed that the Kennedy assassination was the result of a conspiracy at the highest level of the government. Inspired by Garrison's book, Oliver Stone's movie JFK claimed that members of the military, industrial complex, the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, the Mafia, and Lyndon Johnson were behind the assassination. The movie won 2 Academy Awards, and many Americans believe the film is fact. Stone, the king of Hollywood disinformation, once again turned history inside out.
Oliver made a film about JFK that we all know is riddled with tremendous conspiracies, as if LBJ killed JFK. Now, what's good about that film, safe about it, is it is so absurd that it really looks like it's fabrication.
Many people still dismissed the lone gunman theory, saying that one man could not bring down the world's most powerful person. On Monday, March 30th, 1981, a lone gunman came within inches of taking down President Ronald Reagan.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, it is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
In August of 1964, 2 attacks on American ships off the coast of North Vietnam would signal the beginning of another hot war in the Cold War struggle. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 U.S. Marines land near Da Nang in South Vietnam. On March 19, 1965, Gheorghe Dej, Romania's first communist dictator, dies. 3 days later, officials of the Politburo turn to Nicolae Ceausescu and elect him General Secretary, thus beginning the 30-year rule of one of the most corrupt and brutal dictators in history. Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu would institute a cult of personality, turning Romania into a laboratory for fear, misery, and poverty. In June of 1967, the fast and decisive Six-Day War in the Middle East came to an abrupt end. Victorious Israeli forces had taken control of the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The defeat of the Soviet-backed countries of Egypt and Syria would have repercussions for many years to come. On the December 1968 cover of Time magazine, Yasser Arafat's face was seen by the world for the first time. Arafat was a product of the Kremlin's science of disinformation, and he ultimately became an expert in manipulating this invisible weapon. As a first step, the KGB destroyed the official records of Arafat's birth in Egypt, replacing them with fictitious documents that he had been born in Jerusalem.
It amazed me at what great lengths the KGB took to transform an Egyptian-born Marxist into the Palestinian-born terrorist, Yasser Arafat. It took the KGB many years to endow Arafat with a credible birth certificate and other identity documents, to build him a new past and to train him at the KGB Special Operations Training School east of Moscow. The KGB gave Arafat an ideology and an ideological image. The Soviet disinformation machinery portrayed Arafat as a rabid anti-Zionist, an image that was not at all difficult.
The Russians trained the terrorist organizations that we see today. The Ayatollah Khomeini and his people, they were also trained by the Soviets. Yasser Arafat was trained by the Soviets. Mr. Pacepa is a good witness for that too.
Oleg Gordievsky, a former KGB officer who defected to Britain, revealed that in the 70s, the KGB had secretly brought Arafat's terrorists into the Soviet Union to be trained. The KGB Disinformation Department tasked Arafat to create and head a terrorist group named Fatah, and in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, it catapulted him up as chairman of the PLO. The Mitrokhin archive also details Arafat's close collaboration with the KGB. In 1978, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and his KGB chairman Yuri Andropov started a disinformation plot. The goal? Get the United States to establish diplomatic relations with Arafat. The idea was simple: have Arafat pretend to transform the terrorist PLO into a government in exile that was willing to renounce terrorism. Brezhnev and Andropov believed that newly elected President Jimmy Carter would swallow the bait. As Washington's most favorite tyrant, Moscow gave Ceausescu the job.
Ceausescu envisioned that this disinformation plot might bring the Nobel Peace Prize to both Arafat and himself. That year, I accompanied Ceausescu to Washington, where he convinced Carter that he could persuade Arafat to transform his PLO into a law-abiding government in exile. If the United States would establish official relations, of course.
In 1994, Arafat was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Yet in 2002 alone, there were over 13,000 incidents of terrorism against Israelis committed by Arafat's PLO. 6 months later, the number of Israeli civilians killed by Arafat's martyrs exceeded 700. Few people have noticed that Mahmoud Abbas, who took Arafat's place, was educated in the former Soviet Union. Abbas graduated from Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, a KGB-controlled school whose secret task was to create a new generation of foreigners dedicated to promoting the Kremlin's interests.
Vietnam. United States helicopter gunships backed up ground forces in a strong assault on a Viet Cong position only 3 miles from Saigon's Tan Son Nhut Air Base.
Arnaud de Borchgrave has played a role in world affairs known to no other journalist. He served as chief correspondent for Newsweek and was later appointed editor-in-chief for the Washington Times.
The North Vietnamese were very clever in exercising disinformation, as were the Soviets, about the Vietnam War. They had made themselves out to be the good guys against the American puppets that were considered the bad guys. And disinformation was so effective in the United States, much more than it was in Vietnam, which led some of the North Vietnamese generals in their memoirs after the war. They were amazed to see how they were winning something called the Tet Offensive in 1968, that they had won that offensive, when the exact opposite was true. They attacked 27 cities simultaneously. And the South Vietnamese and us, sometimes together, sometimes the South Vietnamese alone, kicked them out of every single city within 24 hours. And yet Walter Cronkite, and I was on the roof of the Caravel Hotel when he arrived with his flak jacket and helmet. We were in safari suits sipping a gin and tonic. There was no danger whatsoever at that particular moment on the roof of the Caravel Hotel. And he broadcast to the world, "We've lost the war." And Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, said, "If Walter Cronkite is against me, I can't run for re-election."
By 1968, the small war in Vietnam had grown to its peak. America engaged in a limited war as part of a strategy to contain the spread of communism without provoking a wider confrontation with the Soviet Union. The Soviet disinformation machine took full advantage of the situation.
America, most of us don't realize this, was winning the Vietnam War. And if you think about it, the United States of America can beat a little country like North Vietnam in battle. How could they not? And the Soviets knew this, because this was basically a kind of a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union being fought in Vietnam. And so the only way they could really win would be to mess around with the hearts and minds of Americans, basically to demoralize Americans, turn them against the war effort, and then get Congress, as it eventually did, to cut and run.
On April 22nd, 1971, a former Navy lieutenant testified to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations.
They had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads, taped wires from portable telephones to human genitals and turned up the power, cut off limbs, blown up bodies, randomly shot at civilians, razed villages in a fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan.
Although Kerry never fully revealed the source of the accusations, I recognize them as being the product of another KGB disinformation operation.
Senator Kerry went and threw his medals over the White House fence in protest. Well, that was all a ploy to increase his status and draw attention to him. But the reality is, the things that he testified as to having seen, he never saw those things. He was perpetuating the myth of the left about our young men and women that served in Vietnam. And I think it's high time for Senator Kerry to come clean and apologize for what he did.
We expect this of the Soviets, okay? They were our enemy. By proxy, they were the enemy we were fighting in Vietnam. We don't expect this from a person like John Kerry, and that message was carried forth by the so-called mainstream news media in the U.S.
Throughout history, Americans had never before been anti-American. They were always a proud and independent people who loved their country and who won every military conflict up until its wars against communism. Then suddenly, a number of Americans began turning against their country's own wars. By 1968, the anti-Vietnam War protesters in the U.S. numbered almost 7 million. They came to regard their own government, not communism, as the enemy.
The general perception in the U.S. is that America's anti-war movement was a homegrown product. In reality, it was the result of a still very secret disinformation operation ignited by the KGB. Its purpose was twofold. First, to counteract American efforts to stop communist expansion. And second, to create doubt around the world about American power, judgment, and credibility. It fulfilled both aims. KGB chief Yuri Andropov baptized the Operation Ares after the Greek god of war. Andropov was convinced that the war in Vietnam provided a once-in-a-lifetime chance to make Europe fear America's military terror, and he made Operation Ares a foremost priority.
In order to conceal its hand, in 1967 the KGB created the so-called Stockholm Conference on Vietnam and staffed it with undercover KGB officers. This new front organization received an average of $15 million yearly from the Soviet Communist Party. During the 5 years of its existence, it spread around the world countless scathing disinformation articles and photographs, supposedly depicting the debaucheries committed by the Genghis Khan-style American military against Vietnamese civilians.
In a long discussion with Andropov about Operation Ares, he said that it turned America against her own government. It damaged America's foreign policy consensus, poisoned her domestic debate, and transformed the world's leftists into deadly enemies of American imperialism. He said, all we have to do is to continue planting the seeds of Ares, and eventually, American leftists would start pursuing it of their own accord. In the end, our original involvement would be forgotten, and Ares would take on a life of its own.
Sadly, Andropov's prediction came true. The U.S. elections of 1974 brought in a new Congress dominated by leftist Democrats, who immediately restricted the financing of the war in Vietnam, and in 1976 cut the funding altogether. As the U.S. forces precipitously pulled out of Vietnam, the victorious communists massacred some 2 million people.
Soviet Union had an agenda. Again, it's something that people don't get even today. They think Putin is just another guy. I mean, the Soviet Union wanted to take over the world. So even Vietnam War, I meet people, intelligent people, who are totally confused about Vietnam War. My secretary is proud that she marched, changed herself, and, make love, not war. I mean, it was terribly executed, but the goal, America had to stop the spread of communism. It is like cancer, basically.
In 1972, my life changed dramatically. Ceausescu made me the deputy chief of the Foreign Intelligence Service. Within a short time, I had absolute power over all the top organizations dealing with the West. So I was now inside the inner circle, and I saw up close Ceausescu, the country's idolized leader. It shocked me to find he didn't give a damn about the country. All he cared about was his power. And his illiterate wife was even more disgusting, spending vast sums of the country's money on herself. They both wanted to create their own dynasty for Romania.
I traveled throughout that whole country, and the only picture billboard you ever saw was Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu's picture. Throughout the whole country, you never saw a billboard advertisement for anything.
Nicolae Ceausescu became a member of the Communist Party as a teen in 1932. He was first arrested in 1933 at the age of 15 for street fighting, and for the next 10 years spent his life in and out of prisons and prison camps. In 1943, he was transferred to Târgu Jiu internment camp, where he shared a cell with Romania's future dictator, Gergu Desh. By 1954, he became a full member of the Politburo, and in 1967, the communist head of Romania. Was it sheer luck or damnable fate? In 1971, Ceausescu was inspired by the personality cults of North Korea's Kim Il-sung and China's Mao Zedong. Shortly after returning home, he began to emulate North Korea's system. Ceausescu created a pervasive personality cult, giving himself such titles as the Genius of the Carpathians, and even had a king-like scepter made for himself.
In January of 1972, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and his KGB chief, Yuri Andropov, believed the West was eager to encourage the least sign of thaw in a communist leader. In order to test this theory, they wanted to build Ceausescu up and make him a big box office success in the West through glasnost. A man like me is born only once every 500 years, Ceausescu would proclaim over and over again after that. That was his glasnost, and unfortunately, I was deeply involved in it.
A French historian, actually of Romanian origin and political scientist, once said that the tragedy of the Cold War is that we have a rivalry between an amoral power, i.e. the Soviet Union, and a moralistic power, the United States. Okay, it's very hard for moralistic people, for people like Jimmy Carter to some extent and others, to really believe that those whom you talk to are lying. Lying, simply lying. Since you grew up with the idea that to lie is a sin, you cannot think that to lie is a virtue in the mind of your rival. And this is basically, a great Polish philosopher once said, until the West understands that lie is the immortal soul of communism, the West will not be able to deal in a realistic way with the communist threat. Because you deal with, we speak different languages. It's fundamentally different moral languages.
Glasnost meant self-promotion, an old Russian term for polishing the ruler's image. It was regarded as a tool of the black art of disinformation to sanctify the country's leader. For communists, only the leader counted. Glasnost is one of the most secret secrets of the Kremlin. Thus, a devious glasnost plan for image reconstruction was launched, and Ceausescu followed it to the letter.
When Ceausescu came to Washington, he was given a red carpet treatment as if he was a close friend. And this was how clever the whole Soviet operation was in terms of disinforming us into believing that the Romanian intelligence service was separate from the KGB, therefore could work with the CIA.
Every time I went to Romania, Romanians would ask me, does America know what's going on with us? When will America come? Does America know what's going on? They were so hungry for hope. They were so hungry. When will our salvation come? Who will deliver us from this nightmare? It was just a country ruled by fear.
With all the power I gained, somehow I hoped I might be able to eliminate some of the endemic corruption. I was wrong. The corruption was so ingrained that nothing could stop it. Eventually I realized that I too was just as corrupt as the rest of them. Freely I had all their Western clothes, drinks, cigarettes, watches, anything else I could possibly want. I realized then that I would have to screw up my courage and break with this evil society. But privilege can generate cowardice. Communist rulers have always been very generous with their spy chiefs until they tire of them and kill them off. It proved hard for me to renounce my exorbitant lifestyle, my villa with its swimming pool, my fleet of cars and drivers, and my hunting lodges in the Carpathian Mountains. The more I thought about it, the harder it was for me to start down that path of no return. I knew that Ceausescu would do everything he could to kill me, so I got cold feet and put aside all thought of defecting. As I was now in the inner sanctum of the Soviet bloc intelligence community, I was sent to Moscow to meet with Andropov, the chairman of the Soviet KGB. He told me about the next step in his Middle East disinformation strategy. He called it a petri dish of hatred waiting to be exploited, the greatest disinformation campaign of modern times.
630 AD, the political religion of Islam begins its cancerous spread across the Middle East. Within 100 years, the Muslims' bloody conquest and subjugation of others through invasion and war reaches the very heart of France. Beaten back at the Battle of Tours, the cancer would resurge once more as the Ottoman Empire. With the First World War, dreams of world domination are lost again as Islam's empire is crushed and the Muslim world stagnates in a medieval state. Even though multiple countries are carved from the Ottoman Empire and given into the hands of Muslim rulers, hatred for the West seethes. The Middle East becomes a petri dish of ancient hatred for Jews and the reconstituted Jewish state. In the late 1960s, the Soviet Union finds an ally and thus begins an exploitation that reverberates to this day in one of the greatest campaigns of disinformation, an insidious formula to undermine and destroy Western civilization, a strategy still at work today. Prepare yourself for an eye-opening revelation as we unravel the world of disinformation.
Disinformation is a kernel of truth around which you weave a tissue of falsehoods.
And that twist with a lie is disinformation.
People have manipulated. The media is manipulated and manipulating.
Disinformer has no respect for means.
Disinformation has a very long-term strategic objective.
An influence campaign to influence American attitudes, to influence public opinion.
Disinformation appears to come from a trusted source. A lie buys a government.
Disinformation flows from the delusion that you can change the world. It's very sinister.
Disinformation has been going on for years and years.
If you can get the New York Times to release your misinformation, it becomes disinformation.
It's deceptive, it's disgusting, it's despicable, and it's part of their political program.
It's part of an overall strategy.
As we see disinformation as a way to sidestep us, particularly in the intelligence world.
Disinformation has been part of the art of war going back to ancient times.
Disinformation is pervasive. It's pervasive in our society and in our culture.
It's a form of psychological warfare.
In 1972, Lieutenant General Mihai Pacepa was named the Deputy Chief of the Foreign Intelligence Service for Romania. Within a short time, he had absolute power over all the top organizations dealing with the West.
As I was now in the inner sanctum of the Soviet bloc intelligence community, I was sent to Moscow to meet with Yuri Andropov, the chairman of the Soviet KGB. He told me about the next step in his Middle East disinformation strategy.
Yuri Andropov had begun his unprecedented 15 years as KGB chairman just a few months before the 1967 Six-Day War. Israel soundly defeated the Soviet Union's most important allies in the Arab world, Egypt and Syria. In those days, both were in effect being run by Soviet advisors. As the new KGB chairman, Andropov decided to repair the Kremlin's prestige by humiliating Israel. His master plan was to revive anti-Semitism, to regenerate international terrorism against the United States and Israel. Hundreds of undercover agents infiltrated the Islamic target countries, and by 1978, the Soviet bloc intelligence community had sent some 4,000 such agents. The KGB planted the seed by distributing an Arabic translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, along with documentary material proving that the United States was a Zionist country whose aim was to start a new crusade on the Islamic world. Thousands of copies were disseminated throughout the Middle East.
This was certainly one of the greatest disinformation campaigns of modern times.
Kids in many Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries, read the protocols. The textbooks have references to the protocols as if this is the real, reliable documents.
America is the great Satan, and Israel is the little Satan. That's what every leftist believes, and that's what every Islamist believes. And that would be what the KGB believed. So get the Jews.
The terrorist war came into action at the end of 1968, when the KGB transformed airplane hijacking into an instrument of terror. Before 1969 came to an end, Palestinian terrorists, trained by the KGB, had hijacked their first El Al plane and landed it in Algeria. The hijacking had been planned and coordinated by the KGB, but to conceal his hand and drop off had the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a KGB front group, take credit for the hijacking. During the next 2 years, various KGB-trained Palestinian terrorists took credit for hijacking 13 Israeli and Western planes. All these hijackings were masterminded by the KGB.
The Soviet Union was very involved with Arab nationalists, basically from, the World War II period on, if not before. In the latter part of its lifespan, the Soviet Union began developing and I think very aggressively engaged in supporting people who weren't so much Arab nationalists as they were Islamists or jihadists, but in some degree were the sort of follow-on, the successors to the Arab nationalists. They trained terrorists. They helped them become much more formidable in terms of threat. And to varying degrees, they enabled or certainly facilitated their association with and interoperations in some cases with terrorists that the Soviets were also involved with in other parts of the world.
The political success of hijacking Israeli airplanes prompted the KGB to expand into organizing public executions and attacks on Jews in airports, train stations, and other public places. The KGB threw millions of dollars and thousands of people into Andropov's disinformation and terror war.
Here's the thing. The Islamists have been to school, particularly the Palestinians, with the KGB and the communists during the Cold War. What the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, didn't learn from the KGB, they've learned from the American and European left.
Andropov preached to me that in today's world, when nuclear arms have made military force obsolete, terrorism should become our main weapon against American Zionism. He looked at the Muslim world as a waiting petri dish in which we could nurture a strain of hate America, grown from the bacterium of Marxist-Leninist thought. Their illiterate, oppressed mouths could easily be whipped up to a fever pitch. We had only to keep repeating over and over that the United States was a warmongering Zionist country, anxious to take over the world.
Anti-American, anti-Zion, they're opposite Zionism. They're opposite sides of the same coin. And if it's easier to excite someone with anti-Zionism, knowing that it will also produce anti-Americanism, that is a classic invitation to disinformation specialists.
If you read Khomeini's biography carefully, you'll see that he was trained both by Nazis and by Soviet communists on how to organize his movement. So the whole structure of the cadres inside the Khomeini movement came straight from Moscow.
Well, I've seen intel reports over the years that the Russians were working with the Palestinian terrorist organizations, not just Hamas, but the PLO and others.
And the PLO trained in the Soviet Union. It's the least secret fact in the modern world. And the alliance between radical Muslims and the world communist organizations is very intimate and has been there all along. Nothing new. And why not? They have a common view of the kind of society and government they want to have, totalitarian, and they have a common enemy, us.
What's quite striking as we flash forward to today is the ways in which one of their clients, the Muslim Brotherhood, has emulated and frankly improved upon, is targeting all of the civil society institutions in this country and our government for the purposes of subverting us and ultimately achieving their victory.
If you look at the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, their heroes are Nazis. Their heroes are people who kill people because they're Jews, not because of anything they did, just because they're Jews. Their children are taught to hate Jews and want to kill them.
The cumulative effect of distributing millions of Arabic translations of the protocols in Arabic over 20+ years throughout the Islamic world may be self-evident.
July 22nd, 1978, a date I will never forget. I was ordered to organize the killing of Noel Bernard, the director of Radio Free Europe's Romanian program. I knew then I had to ultimately decide, would I be a defector or a murderer? Disinformation means lying, and lying is the first step towards stealing and killing. I might have done a lot of reprehensible things during all those years, but I had resolved never to be involved in political assassinations. The prospect pushed me over the edge. My father's heed that I must be strong to be different rang in my ears, and I suddenly became strong enough to break from the darkness. On Sunday, July 23rd, 1978, I flew to Bonn, where I had to deliver a message from Ceausescu to the West German Chancellor. It was my final assignment for the megalomaniac. So I became a defector, a word that was too close to traitor and felt like a chain around my neck. My defection became a whirlwind trip in a CIA plane sent from Washington. It was past midnight when I secretly flew out of Germany. Throughout all those years of torment in Romania, I had been certain that I would not die under communism, no matter how high I might have been shoved up the communist ladder. At Andrews Air Force Base, I was greeted as a free man. The joy of finally becoming part of this land of liberty, where nothing was impossible, well, that was surpassed only by the joy of simply being alive. Alone in my room that night, I fell to my knees and prayed out loud for the first time in more than 25 years. It took me a while. It was hard for me to find the right words to express my great joy and thanks to the good Lord. Forgiveness for my past life, strength for my new life, that's all I asked for.
General Mihai Pacepa defected in July, and that changed everything. He's the senior defector from the Cold War, two-star general, advisor to President Dictator for Life Nicolae Ceausescu. I was involved in debriefing the general for years. When a person defects, you ask what they know, what knowledgeability they have, microwave transmissions, scientific, technical, whatever. And he said, in 5 years, I'll begin to forget things you haven't yet asked me. And he was right. So he knew it all.
The first time I heard the name of Ion Mihai Pacepa was in 1978, listening to Radio Free Europe. It was in the summer of 1978, and they announced that the head of the Romanian Foreign Intelligence, advisor to President Nicolae Ceausescu, General Ion Mihai Pacepa, defected to the West. I called a friend of mine, and I said, let's get together. I said, have you ever heard of this Pacepa fellow and so on? So I said, oh, nobody talks about him. He was a very, very big shot.
General Pacepa had, as we know, a crisis of conscience, a change of heart, and he eventually came away from the dark side and came to the U.S. and helped the CIA to figure out the communist world.
Listen, I have to say that Pacepa is one of a handful of people in my life who has given me a fundamentally different and accurate understanding of the way the world works. He's illuminated the history of the modern world to me.
Before he defected to the U.S., he never had contact my understanding with U.S. intelligence, not with me, not with the CIA, when he decided to jump, it was everything or nothing. That's important. Before he defected, he had a trip that he arranged to all the Eastern European intelligence chiefs, just to talk about how you're doing, what kind of things you have. He would tell what he had, they would tell. Hungarian, the Czech, the Polish. So when he came out, he was that much more valuable because he knew those countries' information as well. I mean, that's a big deal. So how far in advance did he plan it? Like, oh, this, I just thought of it overnight. No, that's a months in advance trip.
I have publicly supported the idea that what General Pacepa did in 1978 was a service to the Romanian people. He didn't betray Romania or the Romanian nation. He betrayed a despicable terrorist dictatorship. And I think that in so doing, he helped the survival of the idea of honor in the history of Romania.
Soon after Pacepa's defection, Ceausescu imposed 2 death sentences and decreed a bounty of $2 million for Pacepa's death. Terrorist leaders Arafat and Gaddafi set $1 more million reward each.
The first major attempt to kill me in the U.S. was codenamed Operation 363, and it used Carlos the Jackal as the would-be assassin. Thanks to the CIA, Carlos was unable to find me.
Although Pacepa had been granted asylum, much of the information he gave the Carter administration was dismissed. The disinformation campaign that he'd helped launch to create a westernized image of Ceausescu had worked. Jimmy Carter had determined that he could end the Cold War by welcoming Ceausescu as a new type of communist, a democratic communist.
The State Department and administration helping Romania to maintain its most favored nation trade status is to blurt out what I knew about the inner workings of the Soviet bloc's disinformation machinery. I immediately reported that Ceausescu's glorious image in Washington had been handcrafted by the KGB. That was not good news for President Carter, who had just 3 months earlier had publicly hailed Ceausescu as a great national and international leader. Thus, Carter alleged that my defection had been concocted by the KGB to destroy his excellent relations with Ceausescu.
Ceausescu was unaware of Carter's distrust and dismantled much of the Warsaw Pact's spy service in the West. It was not until the election of Ronald Reagan that Pacepa was able to impart his valuable information to the West.
I came here right before Reagan. I remember being interviewed in the beginning. People said, oh, you're from the former Soviet Union, you were a dissident, what do you think? Who's going to win? And I said, that's obvious to me, Ronald Reagan. And this is before it became clear that he has a good chance. They said, really? Why? I said, finally, we have a president who gets it, who understands what the real evil is. The Soviet Union is not joking. They work 24/7 to destroy the world, to take over the world. They're not joking. They mean it. I meant it. Millions of people are willing to die to destroy America.
With God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. God bless you and thank you.
Thank you very much. So that every time he wrote an LHM that came from Pacepa, it was going right to Reagan. So the headquarters and the West Wing of the White House, through his national security advisor and to the president. Well, it made me write them really as carefully as I could, make sure we had it all straight, especially because we were debriefing in Romanian. But that's the intensity and the level of consequence.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
In 1987, Pacepa's book, Red Horizons, allowed the world to see Ceausescu naked, the way he really was, an assassin and an international terrorist. His life of outrageous luxury was paid for with money obtained from the illegal sale of human beings, arms, and drugs.
Ceausescu was probably one of the most evil. It was darker in Romania, both kilowatt and evil-wise, than it was even in Moscow. Ceausescu was a very evil man, and his wife, Elena. But when Pacepa asked me, I read his book, and later I took Pacepa's book down to the White House and gave it to the president. And that helped change the issue of most favored nation trading status.
He would later call it my Bible for dealing with dictators.
Ceausescu had cleverly devised a system he named the Horizons to dupe the West into believing that he was a different sort of communist, and that Romania, therefore, was a different sort of communist country. The big lie: Romania was independent of Moscow, more interested in trade with the West, and less repressive than other Soviet bloc countries.
In 1988, Red Horizons was serialized on Radio Free Europe and heard in Romania for the first time. Pacepa's book revealed the damnable corruption of the Marxist government of Romania in great detail.
And I remember being in Romanian homes where they'd close the curtains and they'd get on the ground and turn on that radio frequency, and they made sure even their kids weren't home because kids informed on parents. And when Pacepa's book came out and Pacepa's revelations, it was like it gave power to the powerless. I can't even explain. Romanians were, I've never seen such, it was like finally, someone that people will listen to has made known of our suffering and our oppression and our plight. I knew instinctively this was going to be the beginning of this, the end of this regime. It was like, a drop of water to an army that was just sleeping.
I have always said that Red Horizons is the single greatest portrait of a communist society that I've ever read.
A lot of this was what Romanians and a lot of other people learned through Mike Pacepa's book, Red Horizons, because the corruption, the incredible self-dealing, brutality, and all the rest of the Romanian communist establishment, Ceausescu and the others, both Ceausescus, was stunning.
And the image of Ceausescu and his crowd in the clique in the book was basically one of a thug, of basically a group of gangsters who took over Romania, and were fundamentally, the second thing, were basically, in spite of their pretense to have an independent foreign policy very different from the Soviet Union, in reality being Soviet tools. That shattered the whole edifice, the whole world of pretense, including the immense amount of disinformation that Ceausescu and his crowd were producing and disseminating in the West.
Across Europe this wall will fall, for it cannot withstand faith, it cannot withstand truth. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
On November 9th, 1989, as I sat in front of my television watching the Berlin Wall being torn down, and my eyes welled up with tears, I was incredibly proud to be a citizen of the United States. The whole world was expressing its gratitude to this great country for its 45 years of successfully winning the Cold War against the Soviet Empire.
As mysteriously as it had begun, the Cold War came to an end. Ronald Reagan had refused to continue the policy of containment and determined to put an end to the evil empire. The fall of the Berlin Wall set in turn a series of events that led to the implosion of the USSR. But had the nightmare of communism really ended?
The horrible irony about it is that these are the gulags that was still they were created and are still functioning from 1937. I mean, it's just imagine Auschwitz is slightly refurbished and modernized, is still being used for European prisoners, and we don't think in those terms, but we should. It's the same tradition. It's the same formula.
I witnessed how Hitler's Third Reich had been demolished, its war criminals put on trial, its military and police forces disbanded, and the Nazis removed from public office. None of these things has happened in the former Soviet Union. No individual has been put on trial, although the regime killed millions of people. Most Soviet institutions have been left in place, and we seem to forget that Russia still has over 6,000 nuclear missiles.
When the Cold War ended, there were actually Russians that said to us, don't believe that we're going away. There were a number of Russians who made that statement to us. We're not going away. We're changing our strategy. So how do you change your strategy? Well, you know, you go underground. You change the name of your organization. You change the name of the KGB. Well, the KGB by any other name is still the KGB. It is still the most influential entity in Russia today, more powerful actually than the Politburo. And it is powerful because the man that is in charge of Russia is a former member of the KGB and considers himself to still be in charge of the KGB. They never lost their focus on destroying America. But I think that they saw that there was a new strategy to be used that would allow us to destroy ourselves. Wow. I think we're doing that, aren't we?
In December 1989, anti-government demonstrations began throughout Romania, and a revolt spread across the country. On December 25th, Ceausescu and his wife were executed by firing squad, bringing to an end one of the last communist regimes in Europe. A Romanian newspaper concluded the publication of Red Horizons played an uncontested role in revealing in all its hideousness the true face of a dictatorship, which with diabolical cunningness had managed to outfox a part of the world. After the implosion of the USSR, most top U.S. political leaders considered the Soviet Union and its KGB to be ancient history.
My last election, yeah. After my election, I had more flexibility. I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir, I understand it.
Soviet intelligence, in terms of its people, in terms of its apparatuses, in terms of its modus operandi, I think is very much alive and well today, and by some accounts operating, for example, in this country at a level that actually exceeds that of the Cold War.
Many in America have bought into another Kremlin disinformation. The Cold War may be over, but unlike other wars, the defeated enemy didn't lay down its weapons. The KGB merely changed its name to the FSB, and Vladimir Putin, a KGB spy chief, enthroned himself in the Kremlin as supreme leader. Thus, he transformed Russia into the first intelligence dictatorship in history.
Putin is pretty straightforward. He has stated that he's going to reform the military, he's going to boost the military, and that that the United States is basically the enemy. The fact that we dismiss that or try to low-key it, and downplay it is actually a disservice to us. And I think it's all part of the whole political reset approach that we want to take with the Russians. And there's a lot of political reasons for doing that, such as the Middle East.
In August 1999, only days after Putin's appointment, the KGB's framing machinery went back to work.
When Putin was in Germany, they like to say that he was like Peter the Great. He saw Europe, he saw the rest of the world. He was in East Germany, doing a scam in East Germany. He didn't see the rest of the world. He didn't see London and the U.S. and places you need to see to become worldwide and understand it. They're very, very contained in that. But my view is it hasn't changed. But the concept of disinformation, I'll give an example or so that it's much bigger than what we would think. Not just because General Pacepa has said how many hundreds, thousands of people are involved. More people than are in the FBI, for instance, are involved in every aspect with this information over there.
I think the instinctive reaction from Putin is to oppose whatever it is that the Western democracies are supporting.
He sees us, I think, as essentially an enemy. Because the example we set, and it's not just us, it's other countries too, the example that we set undermines his ability to order everybody around.
We have to remember that Russia lost its international influence with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Putin is a kind of mock dictator, small dictator. As a KGB man, Vladimir Putin cannot think any differently. He thinks the same way as Stalin did. He wants that power, and he can have it with that link that he can provide towards it with Ahmadinejad or North Korea.
President Vladimir Putin, an ex-lieutenant colonel in the KGB, he once said that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you translate this, then the greatest, probably bureaucratic catastrophe of the 20th century for Putin was the collapse of the KGB.
Soon after President Putin and his ex-KGB officers began running Russia, they moved their country back into the encampment of the Soviet Union's traditional clients, which had been the deadliest enemies of the United States. Putin started out favoring precisely the three governments labeled by the U.S. as an axis of evil: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea.
There's no change in disinformation. With what they had as the KGB, now the FSB, don't think that because the wall came down and because Gorbachev is gone and maybe working in San Francisco with some sort of a think tank, don't think that that has changed.
For all practical purposes, the FSB behaves and undertakes the same types of efforts.
20 years later, after the USSR collapsed, we're back, and with a vengeance, because KGB is now in the helm of power.
So the Soviet Union is now run pretty much single-handedly by a son of the KGB, a man who has never been anything but a creature of the KGB. They can change the name, but it remains a very powerful force in Russia today, which is deeply regrettable, mostly for the people of Russia. Their opportunity for real democracy has been significantly eroded, and I think unless something intervenes, it's a matter of time before it's gone completely.
With deadly secrecy, the Kremlin began arming the anti-American Arab terrorists, just as they had done in Andropov's day. On July 12, 2006, militants of Hezbollah, armed by Putin's Russia, launched a powerful rocket attack against Israel. Most of the Hezbollah weapons cases captured by the Israeli military forces during that offensive were marked Customer, Ministry of Defense of Syria, Supplier, KBP, Tula, Russia. Hezbollah has also been recently armed with the Russian-designed Far-5 rockets, Zelzal-1 rockets, Scud missiles, as well as Russian anti-tank missiles. Putin also quietly reinstituted sales of weapons to Iran and engaged Russia in the construction of a 1,000-megawatt nuclear reactor at Bushehr. The uranium conversion facility is capable of producing fissile material for nuclear weapons. Hundreds of Russian technicians also started helping the government of Iran to develop the Shahab missile system, which can carry a nuclear or germ warhead to anywhere in the Middle East and Europe.
The big dog in the Persian Gulf region right now, because they are developing a nuclear weapon, is Iran. So if they could establish that kind of influence and the Iranians would essentially dominate the Persian Gulf region, the Russians corner the market on gas and oil.
Russia sees helping Iran and working with Iran, and it did with Syria as well, as a very good way to undermine American influence in the Middle East.
Clearly, Iran is one of Mr. Putin's greatest allies. They're a great trading partner with him. Has built their nuclear power plants and probably has supplied them with a lot of other technology.
We have to look realistically at the potential of a nuclear-armed Iran as being a huge threat, not only to America, but to global stability.
Iran's current president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, had already announced that nothing could stop his country from building nuclear weapons, and he stated that Israel was a disgraceful stain on the Islamic world that would be eliminated. During World War II, thousands of Americans died to eradicate Nazism and its anti-Semitic terrorism. Now we're facing Islamofascism and nuclear anti-Semitic terrorism.
In 2006, a former KGB officer, Alexander Litvinenko, defected to Great Britain and revealed some earth-shattering secrets to the British Foreign Intelligence Service. One of those secrets which became public was that the current leader of Al-Qaeda was trained in 1997 by the KGB in Dagestan.
Evidence has also begun to reveal that the Kremlin was involved in igniting and then stealing the 2011 Islamic revolutions called the Arab Spring. In Egypt, the most pro-American Islamic country, anti-government demonstrations started on January 25, 2011. some of the young people there who were allegedly demanding democracy could be seen burning the flag of the very country that symbolizes democracy for most of the world.
So everything is really unpredictable today in the Middle East. Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo. You can see quite a lot of disinformation going on about them in the American press, that they're not as bad as we thought they were, etc. It's ridiculous. And I can't think of a bigger danger for the Middle East than the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. These are people who hate us and want Sharia law to be applied everywhere. And what they've done in the 2 or 3 towns that they've occupied in Mali is cut hands off to punish people.
Russia's intelligence dictatorship is a brand new political phenomenon, and America needs a brand new foreign policy to deal with it. Otherwise, we're looking at an all-new Cold War, one that threatens to be not only cold, but also bloody.
The Russians, notwithstanding the end of the Cold War, still are heavily targeting military technology. The problem today is that the intelligence community is not looking at that in that direction any longer.
It's really behind most of the problems that we've confronted in this so-called post-Cold War world.
I believe Congress should re-examine President Truman's top-secret policy paper, NSC 68-1950. It shaped U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War for 20 years, and it did not blame movies or books for terrorist attacks against the U.S.
NSC 68/1950 stated, "The issues that face us are momentous, involving the destruction not only of this republic, but of civilization itself. The policy focused on creating a world centered on American liberal capitalist values, and it contained a 2-pronged political strategy. 1, a superior military power, and 2, a campaign of truth, defined as a struggle, above all else, for the minds of men." Truman argued that the propaganda used by the forces of communism could be overcome only by the plain, simple, unvarnished truth.
The missiles that destroyed communism were launched from Radio Free Europe, and this was Washington's most important investment during the Cold War. I don't know whether Americans realize this now, over 2 decades after the fall of the Soviet Empire, but on the other side, we understood it perfectly well.
4:30 p.m. in Moscow, September 11th, 2001. Members of the FSB raised their glasses in annual celebration to the birthday of their founder, Felix Dzerzhinsky. During the revolution of 1917, he established and developed the Soviet state security forces that became notorious for torture and mass summary executions. Dzerzhinsky was named Bloody Felix. In 15 minutes, the agents will have something more to celebrate.
These extremists say there can be no compromise or dialogue with those they call infidels. It is foolish to think that you can negotiate with them.
On September 11th, President George W. Bush called for a war on terror. It was a war, he said, that was rooted in ideology, an ideology that followed in the path of fascism, communism, and totalitarianism.
The weapon of choice for that horrific act of terrorism that has changed the face of our world? A hijacked airplane, a concept invented by the KGB. This is Yuri Andropov's legacy, the father of a new disinformation era, the father of the age of terrorism. Andropov's anti-American and anti-Jewish terrorism has grown into a kind of a nefarious science, threatening the whole civilized world.
In the Islamic world, thousands of people danced in the streets for days to celebrate the glorious victory over the American evil. In America, for the first time since the early years of the Vietnam War, the country was united. Democrats and Republicans came together to stop terrorists and terrorist regimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when the presidential election rolled around in 2004, many Democrats developed amnesia.
In the next century, the community of nations may see more and more of the very kind of threat Iraq poses now. A rogue state with weapons of mass destruction.
People have forgotten that for 7.5 years, we found weapons of mass destruction.
Since the inspectors left, intelligence reports show that Saddam Hussein has worked to rebuild his chemical and biological weapons stock.
Saddam Hussein certainly has chemical and biological weapons. There's no question about that.
Even though I approved of Afghanistan and opposed Iraq.
John Kerry said that the Iraq War was the wrong war at the wrong time in the wrong place when he was running for president. What kind of message did that send to a 19-year-old in Fallujah facing terrorists when a man who's within a hair of being president says you shouldn't be there?
I'm John Kerry, and I'm reporting for duty.
During the 2004 Democratic National Convention, one after the other, the convention participants denigrated America's armed forces by portraying their commander-in-chief as a renegade, a liar, a deceiver, and a fraud. The U.S. had over 140,000 soldiers engaged in a grueling war who needed support from all sides. But all they got from that Democratic convention was insults and hatred.
The object of war is to break an enemy's will and destroy his capacity to fight. A nation divided in wartime is a nation that invites its own defeat. The Democrats' public attack, insinuating that the president had deceived the American people, was unimaginable disinformation. It was a replay of exactly what Andropoulos Aries' campaign preached during the Vietnam era.
By 2007, most leaders of the Democratic Party were engaged in a frantic campaign to condemn the U.S. for its war in Iraq and to withdraw troops unconditionally. Senator Harry Reid, the Democratic Majority Leader, famously declared, "The war is lost." Today, many liberals and Democrats still believe that George Bush and America are responsible for the war that radical Islam has launched against us. In October of 2011, the Obama administration officially banned the truth. Bowing to pressure from the Hamas-linked CARE and other Islamic advocacy groups, Deputy U.S. Attorney General James Cole directed all components of the Department of Justice to remove all references to Islam in connection with any examination of Islamic Jihad terror activity, thus placing off limits any investigation of the beliefs, motives, and goals of jihad terrorists.
Obama's Middle Eastern policy is that it's America's fault. And most of the things that have gone wrong in the world are our fault, and so we have to undo that. So that's why the Cairo speech, that's why the Great Apology Tour, right? Same business with Russia, reset the relationship with Russia, as they put it, because after all, we have, we're responsible for a lot of the bad relations between the United States and Russia. So he's been out there basically encouraging the most extreme form of anti-Americanism because he sympathizes with it, because he thinks they're legitimate. So he's been totally unable to recognize the consequences. Whatever you think of him, he doesn't get it.
If we don't recognize the enemy, then how can we defeat him? We have now turned a corner in our history for which there is no precedent, and our divisions over the war are deep and troubling.
We still don't recognize this war. Reminds me of the situation with the Soviet Union. It took us 30 years to eventually recognize that we were in the ideological war in communism. More than 20 years we still don't want to recognize that we are in an ideological war with Islamism. Now, that's critical thing because that determines the whole context. If you realize that you are in ideological warfare, then you realize that you are on the constant disinformation campaign, then you realize that ideological warfare uses terrorism as a weapon against you, which are all part of ideology. Those are not separate events.
It's been a long time coming, but tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
By 2008, some leaders of the Democratic Party began painting America as a decaying, racist, capitalist realm, unable even to provide medical care for the poor. It pledged to change all that by wealth redistribution. The leftist media jumped in, and overnight, change we can believe in was bursting forth everywhere. Change is the very essence of Marxism. It was a brilliant disinformation campaign, and Obama was the perfect instrument. Bright, charismatic, and a dynamic speaker with a seemingly blank slate. After 45 years of Cold War, millions of young Americans now believe that capitalism is their real enemy and should be replaced with socialism. Their new home, the Democratic Party, whose primary 2008 election theme was the promise to redistribute America's wealth.
People always love a free lunch. No wonder the Democratic Party easily filled entire stadiums with people who demanded that the wealth of the United States be redistributed. Some of those electoral gatherings looked like Ceausescu's revival meetings. It was a superb show of disinformation.
I think it's fair to say that no president in American history has done more to subvert the Constitution.
Obama said, I want to transform America. He is transforming America. And there is not enough rebellion, not enough. We need to wake up Americans, get to the young kids before they get brainwashed on campuses.
In 2008, Obama's background, associations, and voting record clearly revealed him to be the hardest left candidate ever nominated for President of the United States. Despite the many revelations, the mainstream media remained silent.
One of the overriding purposes of glasnost is to hide the leader's past by giving him a new political identity. Thus it was that in America, the 2008 election campaign for the White House was, for me, a major case of deja vu. It felt as though I were watching a replay of one of Ceausescu's election campaigns. Just as Ceausescu loved to remind everyone that someone as great as he is born once every 500 years, so did Barack Obama.
We are the ones we've been waiting for.
After Obama's victory in 2008, the White House and the Democratic-controlled Congress began following in Marx's footsteps by redistributing the country's wealth and putting under government control parts of the healthcare, banking system, and automobile industries. Soon, the United States began being changed from a country belonging to we the people into one managed by a kind of a Marxist elite class with unchecked power.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
But the Democratic Party has built into it disinformation because they're leftists and progressives. You know, they said that Obamacare was to cover the uninsured. Now we find out that it's going to, people will be kicked off their medical care because of Obamacare. So it didn't even do that. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was government control of your life. What they call single payer. That's communism. To have only the government supply you with health, what could be more communistic than that?
I came here when President Reagan was president. This is not the same country. Absolutely not.
When tens of thousands of Americans disagreed, a member of the U.S. congressional elite, Democratic Representative Steve Cohen, called them Nazis. It was a tried and true old Marxist tactic to demonize critics. It was a tactic that Obama would skillfully use on his next opponent with great success.
If you got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen.
This is the core of the Communist Manifesto. Its main task was to frame capitalism as a system based on theft, the demonizing of an ownership class that is stealing the labor of a lower class. If you know the manifesto, you would have thought Marx himself wrote Obama's speech.
Communism didn't die with the Cold War. It's alive and well. In fact, it's in the White House. Obama was brought up and spent his life in the same left that I left. Only the worst part of it, the Bill Ayers part. Of course, today's communists are not stupid, and they adjust. But communism that is alive and well and very, very strong because it represents that longing that people have, that life should be meaningful, that the world should be just and ordered.
Change in the direction of greater fairness was still the Democratic Party's theme for the 2012 election, with the main target, American capitalism. In a 2008 Rasmussen poll, only 53% of Americans preferred capitalism to socialism, with another 27% unsure and 20% strongly opting for socialism.
Saul Alinsky, who is the Karl Marx of the Obama left, his whole book is about lying. It's about the ends justify the means. Our ends are so noble because we're going to save the world. In war, any means is justified. And he says it in so many words.
Half of the country is just getting something, but just philosophically, we forgot who we are. America used to stand for something. What do we stand for now?
I fought against communism in the Soviet Union. I survived. I was exiled to the best and freest country in the world, you know, and if after that I start to see in this country the same thing which happened in the Soviet Union, yeah, I don't feel good, and I try to speak out against it, because I know what it means, and with my experience, I recognize any of such things immediately.
The 2012 election ended an American tradition. Capitalism lost the election for the first time in the history of the United States. The Democratic Party's disinformation machinery was able to distort Romney's capitalist past to such a degree that he was always on the defensive, always portrayed as a greedy capitalist predator.
It's a technique of pushing passion buttons in the human spirit to get people to feel angry, jealous, vindictive against people who succeed. But only certain kinds of people who succeed, people on the right who succeed, because people on the left who succeed never get demonized, right? I mean, nobody demonizes Barbra Streisand, right? Here's a woman who sang some songs. She's one of the richest people in America. What has she done for us recently? Nothing. And how come she deserves all that money?
Well, Libya is a very important example. I've interviewed, in my lifetime, I interviewed Gaddafi 6 times. In 1993, off the record, he said, "Do you know Jim Woolsey, the head of the CIA?" I said, "Yes, I've known him a long time, since long before he became director of the CIA." He said, "Well, you have to tell him something very important from me." I said, "What's that, Colonel?" He said, "The Islamists are the biggest danger to you and to me. And they are in Benghazi, and that's their headquarters." He wanted to work with the CIA against the Islamist extremists in Benghazi, and that was 1993.
On September 11, 2012, the American diplomatic mission at Benghazi in Libya was attacked. 4 people were killed, including U.S. Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens. Over the next 14 days, the Obama administration conducted a blatant disinformation campaign.
When you have the United Nations ambassador 5 days after an event, going on the news service and spreading information that is clearly false, there could be no question that everybody knew that what she was saying, to include most of the American public, was false. That is a misinformation campaign, and she is using a disinformation methodology to spread that.
Benghazi is misinformation, disinformation, and no information, all wrapped up.
What troubles me about Benghazi is not that we were wrong in understanding the origin of the attack, at least for a little while, but that the people who knew better dissembled about it. And I think it's obvious they did so for political reasons. We were close to an election. They did not want to acknowledge that the death of al-Qaeda may have been prematurely announced. It would have been embarrassing. And so they skated over the facts, even as the facts became available.
People demonstrating, protesting some video do not show up in front of an American building carrying RPGs. Right? They're not crazy demonstrators who are all upset about some lunatic in California making a movie they don't like.
The purpose was to ensure that the administration was reelected, and that their chances of being reelected were not hurt because they had spread another disinformation that the administration has defeated al-Qaeda, that they're all but non-existent, only to find that not only has it not gone away, but it is very powerful, and we're still their target.
And I think we need to know the truth. I think for the American people not to have that information would be wrong. And so we're going to continue to push it. Whether or not we'll be successful will depend on you and if the American people call their congressmen.
The ultimate expression of this disinformation by the Obama administration was the statement made before the UN General Assembly by the President of the United States, fully 2 weeks after the September 11th attack, in which he again referred to the video, and then he made this statement.
The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam.
Now that's a sentence you could have heard Osama bin Laden, Mohammed Morsi, Ayman Zawahiri, any of these guys say as a justification for their jihadism against us. And it's not just disinformation on the part of the President of the United States. And I'm afraid the Obama administration is prepared to sacrifice our First Amendment rights.
Disinformation has become the bubonic plague of our modern world. Water makes a hole in the stone not by force, but by constant dripping. That is how disinformation works. Drop by drop by drop. It takes time.
Virtually all of America's major institutions today are way to the left of the public. Now think about this. The American public for a long time have polled at 40% self-identify as conservative, 35% self-identify as moderate, and 20 or 21% as liberal. That 40% plus 35% conservative moderate is the center-right majority of America. And yet our institutions, our schools, and especially our colleges, which are absurdly to the left, Hollywood, the entertainment and news media, the foundations and philanthropies, even many of our churches are way over on the left. How did that happen? Antonio Gramsci was this influential Italian communist who made up the phrase, the long march through the institutions. He said that we're going to have to take several generations to subvert, infiltrate, and change all of these institutions. We have a president right now whose watchword was transformation. We're going to fundamentally transform America.
Today, a major source of disinformation is spread through conspiracy theories. Many governments in the Mideast take these theories as fact, much like the protocols of Zion are. The most incendiary still circulating revolve around 9/11, with such fabrications that the CIA or Mossad were behind the attacks, and that no Jews died in the Twin Towers that day.
People like conspiracy theories. It's kind of a substitute for God. That is, it puts order into the world. There's not random chaos and catastrophe. Everything is ordered because there's a conspiracy behind it. So people are prone, they feel comfortable with conspiracy theories.
Over my 27 years in the Soviet bloc intelligence community, I was privy to many Cold War disinformation operations that eventually lost steam, but they were never entirely compromised because of that kernel of truth. So many still haunt the world like ghosts that never die. It seems that Americans have relaxed too much now, and they believe what they want to believe on the basis of whether or not it's convenient.
Americans want to be amused. Now think about it. Muse is to think. Amuse is without thinking. So they'd rather sit in front of the TV and watch a reality show and then take a 30-second soundbite, which could be from the media, it could be a news flash, or it could be a political ad. That political ad, for example, might say, well, the Republicans are for the wealthy and the Democrats are for the common man. And they form their opinion on that 30-second soundbite, and then go back to being amused. Because they make no effort to try and discern the truth. They make no effort to go beyond what is in their comfort zone. So they will believe the lies of the media, and the media does. The media is part of the disinformation campaign.
You know, one of the really interesting things, talking about disinformation, is the extent to which we have now permitted not simply programming that would have been, frankly, unimaginable, I think, during the Cold War, in terms of its sympathy for the Russians and its willingness to portray the United States in a very unflattering light. But we have Russia Today, we have Chinese Xinhua, we have Al Jazeera, and other instruments of enemy propaganda, or certainly the information warfare apparatuses of countries that are unfriendly to the United States, and I think wish us ill, now having access to millions of Americans' homes. And that's a vehicle for disinformation and, for that matter, as I say, political warfare on an epic scale.
The lies have been allowed to become history, to become truth. But what is truth? What is history? Without understanding the outrageous and uniquely Soviet tactic of disinformation, our worldview can become distorted.
There is no defensive strategy in ideological war. There is no defense. You have always be offensive, you have attack. You believe in your own ideas, right? Go ahead, be offensive, attack, promote those ideas, bring it to them. Never be apologetic. Never try to excuse and explain why you have those things. That's absolutely critical, because just you start to do it, people start to have doubts whether you are really right or whether you really yourself believe in those own ideas.
Even today, progressives are subtly repackaging the communists' ideas and legacies and passing them on in the curricula of our schools, in the news media, in Hollywood films, on the internet, and on TV. Over the past several decades, American universities have grown into a hotbed of disinformation.
I'm very concerned about America. I feel this is not the same America that I discovered when I arrived here in 1980. I think the most dangerous source of evil brainwashing and propaganda is coming from Ivy League schools, top-notch schools. The only place on earth where people still believe in Marxism and Leninism and communism.
The only bulwark against disinformation is knowledge. And that's why the educational system is so important, and that's why the current American crisis really is based on the failure of our educational system and the takeover of the educational system by a single ideology. What I cannot stand and what really terrifies me about the country nowadays is that it's so monolithic. And, you know, people start saying, well, look at Obama. Where did Obama get all these crazy ideas from? I keep saying to them, look, Obama is, you can find 1,000 Obamas in chat rooms online or in dormitories, anywhere in our top universities. Just go in, guys sitting around drinking beer and talking. They'll talk just like him because he believes what they believe. They think the same way he thinks. All these slogans based on nothing.
Promoting Marxist ideas and approaches with no mention of the bloody legacy of these doctrines is the rule rather than the exception. College campuses are teeming with anti-America, anti-Jew, and anti-white rhetoric. A professor's job is not to tell students what to think. It is to help them to think critically and for themselves. Yet thousands of professors go to work every day with the intention of indoctrinating their students in their political prejudices. These supposed teachers have even included unrepentant terrorists Bill Ayers, Kathy Bodan, and Bernadine Dorn of the Weather Underground.
Resistance by every means necessary is happening and will continue to happen within the United States as well as around the world, and I remain committed to the struggle ahead.
Secular universities in America, they are radically leftist, not liberal. Liberal is, my dad was a liberal. Okay, we're talking radical leftist, communist, socialist, Marxist, statist. They are learning things in colleges today that have nothing to do with the foundational principles of America and what made America and made those universities even possible.
There's a professor now, I forgot in what school in the United States, who said it's absolutely false that Stalin and the Stalinist regime, not Stalin personally, killed millions of people. What do you do with such a person? And who teaches? And who basically, this is basically a discourse of implicit hatred by denying, basically by killing these people the second time. This is historical pornography.
Following the Boston Marathon bombing, Princeton University professor Richard Falk stated that the U.S. should not be surprised. After all, it supports Israel. Falk quoted a line from poet W.H. Auden. "Those to whom evil is done do evil in return." He went on to suggest that there will be more such attacks, especially if there is no disposition to rethink U.S. relations to others in the world, starting with the Middle East. Such teachers are now no longer confined to university campuses and college courses. In March of 2013, parents in Tennessee discovered their high school students were being taught disinformation from a human geography textbook. Among the many leftist statements and historical inaccuracies was a highly anti-Semitic question dealing with terrorism. The textbook states, "Distinguishing terrorism from other acts of political violence can be difficult. For example, if a Palestinian suicide bomber kills several dozen Israeli teenagers in a Jerusalem restaurant, is that terrorism or wartime retaliation against Israeli government policies and army actions?" In the recent case of the Boston Marathon massacre, carried out by two Caucasian Muslim brothers, one an American citizen, the question is asked, what could be the motivation? Looking at the liberal elite intellectual thought that infects the Boston community and schools might be a good place to start. The younger brother of the pair graduated from the celebrated Boston High School, Cambridge Rindge and Latin School, where he was daily taught anti-American disinformation. His history teacher, Larry Aronson, is a disciple of the raving, America-hating, revisionist historian Howard Zinn. He is taught from the Marxist anti-American history book by Zinn, A People's History of the United States, since 1981. If you don't know Zinn's contempt for America, here's a sample of his work.
Around 1776, certain important people in the English colonies made a discovery that would prove enormously useful for the next 200 years. They found that by creating a nation, a legal entity called the United States, they could take over land, profits, and political power from the favorites of the British Empire.
Zinn was a liberal elite darling who claimed his eyes were open to the racist, imperialist horror that is America by writer I.F. Stone. Stone was a prominent writer in his day, who later was confirmed to be a paid KGB agent when the Iron Curtain fell and certain Soviet documents became public. It is more than coincidental that his articles expressed the position of the Soviet Union on so many issues. Today, the mainstream press is increasingly revealed to be little more than a government propaganda ministry. The big media in today's America are becoming barely more respected and believable than were their Soviet counterparts a generation ago. Some trace it to the 60s cultural revolution, when the radical left literally spilled out into America's streets, while university campuses gave rise to a host of radical new liberation movements. Undeniably, the misnamed mainstream media have been the primary force behind many leftist agendas for at least a generation.
The mainstream media is largely a provider of disinformation.
The news media in America today, I think, can fairly be described as a full-time disinformation machine. You got to remember there are two parts to disinformation. One is the message. It's a lie. It's meant to advance a certain agenda. Okay. The other part of that disinformation machinery is that the delivery vehicle for the message has to be credible, at least in the minds of the people receiving the message. The news media have long been credible to the public mind. Even people that say, yeah, they're kind of liberal, still, people think that if something really bad is happening, the media will tell them about it. And that, unfortunately, has not been the case.
There is hope. Not the Obama kind, but the real kind. A widespread media revolution is in progress, as millions are gravitating to the new media.
Today, you have a very robust talk radio world. You have the internet. I work for WND, which is a big online news organization. Basically, it is a new world where people can go to a news source where they feel comfortable that the basic worldview of the people behind that news source is compatible with theirs.
In the 20th century, film and cinema have become the most powerful tools of information and disinformation. Goebbels in Nazi Germany and Stalin in Russia used the power of film to spread propaganda within their countries and worldwide. Few filmmakers today come under the hand of government control. Unfortunately, though, many filmmakers have bought into the lie of Marxism and socialism and delved deeply into the art of disinformation.
Hollywood is a fascinating case of disinformation because it's disinformation being promulgated by the uninformed. It's people whose minds have already been brainwashed, essentially, then spewing out what they were told by the media to spew out. But the power of Hollywood, because it has a lot of talented people to promulgate this information advertently and inadvertently, is stupendous. In fact, it's probably more powerful than the liberal politicians, because that disinformation is going out to young people whose minds are not critical and and the ground has been prepared in the schools, and the schools are actually taking a liberal pablum movie and showing it to the schools, and the kids think it's real. And
probably the most famous and best at the craft of deceptive cinema is Oliver Stone. Over the last 2 decades, he has produced a string of films that repeatedly demonstrate his Marxist worldview and spew anti-American disinformation. He could have easily worked for the KGB back in the day. In his Untold History of the United States, America is portrayed as an evil force in the events of the last 75 years. The pseudo-documentary film series evokes overt sympathy for the Germans and the Japanese during World War II, as well as for Stalin himself.
It's just total nonsense, and it portrays, again, Comrade Stalin as this poor, misunderstood person. And if we'd only been nicer to Comrade Stalin, things would have worked out so much better. I mean, the Cold War is our fault, according to that.
What he's done for Showtime is much more dangerous, because that presents it as a documentary of World War II and says that the U.S. was unfair to Stalin at Yalta and things like that. And first of all, the average viewer has never heard of Yalta. They vaguely heard of Stalin as kind of a Russian bad guy. They don't know anything about any of this stuff. So they've effectively been propagandized. They've been recipients of disinformation.
I was sitting down with a woman who's a prominent figure in the Hispanic American community, and she was telling me that she was learning all kinds of things about this country that she hadn't known as a result of Oliver Stone and his research.
Historian Ronald Radish calls the Untold History Cold War revisionism, and sees similarities to communist author Karl Marjani's book, We Can Be Friends, The Origins of the Cold War. Over and over, Stone uses the same quotations, the same arrangements of material, and the same arguments as Marjani, a Soviet agent in 1952. Rather than being shouted down, as many did at the release of Stone's JFK, the Untold History has been widely embraced by the left-wing academic establishment and by the progressive culture in general. There have been no outcries over the libels committed on the memories of Truman, Kennedy, or America. This clearly demonstrates how the Soviet disinformation machine has won the culture war in the U.S. Robert Redford is another filmmaker known for his leftist-leaning anti-America disinformation. His recent movie, The Company You Keep, is thinly disguised as an ode to the 60s as the model of activism and terrorism for every future generation to emulate. The 1960s have become to the left what 1776 once was to the old America. Each protest, down to Occupy Wall Street, is looked upon as a rebirth of the spirit of the 60s. The movie paints its main characters, former Weather Underground-type radicals, in a flattering light, even though they confuse murder with idealism and youthful anger with principles.
All the people I knew when I was young wanted America to lose the Cold War. And they did it for what some people call idealistic reasons, but I don't see it that way. That tends to excuse what they did. They were blinded because they believed in a future in which socialism, communism, which there would be social justice. That's the term today for delusional people on the left.
The American left has a long history of treating radical killers like heroes. We see this today as communist murderers such as Stalin, Mao, and Che are lifted to mythical status. Time magazine writes, "The company you keep is streaked with melancholy, a disappointment that the Second American Revolution never came. Of course, the melancholy mourning is not for those murdered, but that the violence fizzled out without accomplishing anything." Thus, the film is another disinformation vehicle, a revisionist history of the 60s in which change might have happened if only the left had never compromised. The real history is that the radicals of the Weather Underground were not passionate and committed intellectuals, but liars and murderers. In the 1960s, Larry Grothwall was an FBI infiltrator posing as a radical communist. When he testified before a federal grand jury in the U.S. Senate, he exposed the real Weather Underground, their bomb-making exploits, their murderous bank robbery, and the unrepentant nature of key underground figures Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn. In Grothwall's true account of the events and the characters involved, he describes military training weathermen received in Cuba with Russian weapons, and details of how sympathetic professors helped set up weathermen bases across American campuses. The weathermen also targeted high schools, which they saw as prisons. It is not surprising that the most prominent terrorist, Bill Ayers, now has a career in education. By training teachers to indoctrinate American children, he exploits the country from within more efficiently than his homemade bombs ever could.
At 1 minute before 1 o'clock this morning, the switchboard at the Capitol received a phone call. A man's voice said a bomb would go off in the building in half an hour. At 1:30 in the morning, it did, in a small, unmarked restroom on the ground floor of the Senate side, next to a barber shop and near several small offices, including one committee hearing room, for a report on the first serious damage to the nation's foremost structure since the British burned it in 1814. Credit for the Capitol bombing was claimed in a letter received by the Associated Press today, signed by the Weather Underground.
Ho Chi Minh's birthday was also marked in Washington. A bomb exploded early this morning in the Pentagon, and left-wing terrorists telephoned newspapers to say they were responsible.
People calling themselves members of the Weather Underground last night planted bombs in federal office buildings in Washington and Oakland, California.
That other bomb threat was a dramatic one at a military induction center in Oakland, California today.
With the sitting U.S. president effectively starting his political career in Bill Ayer's living room, the story of the Weather Underground and its radical ideology isn't going away.
People poo-pooing, oh yeah, he had friends who were terrorists and whatever, you know. I didn't have any friends who were terrorists. I worked undercover against terrorists. I met with terrorists.
In 1999, French scholar Stéphane Courtois' Black Book of Communism charged Marxism-Leninism with being responsible for the deaths of 150 million human beings since the Russian Revolution of 1917. When KGB archives became public in the post-Cold War era, those calculations were shown to be more than credible. Many have begun to face the sobering reality that the human devastation perpetrated by communism surpasses even Nazism's shameful record.
The Soviet Union did kill more people than Hitler. I mean, some sources suggest there was up to 60 million people. And just imagine one country killing 60 million people in the Stalin era alone.
Throughout the world, communism turned mass crime into a full-blown system of government, and disinformation played a significant role in these crimes of the century. Hitler resorted to disinformation to portray the Jews as an inferior and loathsome race so as to rationalize his Holocaust. Disinformation was the tool used by Lenin and Stalin to dispossess a third of the world and transform it into a string of gulags. Disinformation has also set off the international terrorism that threatens us today.
Disinformation has caused worldwide damage to the reputation of the United States, and now it's putting down roots here. To fight this invisible weapon, we must first recognize it for what it is and decode its hidden mission, since it is usually clothed in innocuous civilian dress, as were the terrorists who killed 3,000 Americans on September 11th.
My guess is that the Ronald Reagan of 1976 would be very clear about the mortal peril that is facing our country. And he would set about, in his inimitable way, laying out an optimistic but very hard-headed strategy for trying to turn things around, for getting our government back onto a track that respects and upholds and defends our Constitution. I think he would also be very clear about the sort of threat that he recognized in his time from totalitarians, especially their ability to use not only violence and the threat of violence, but also disinformation as a means of subverting us and destroying us from within.
In another few years, we will not be a superpower in any way. Not economically, not militarily, not intellectually, not in any way, unless the pendulum swings. But I am an optimist. I love this country. I've been all over the world. I do believe the American spirit. I do believe that Americans, you can push them up to a point, but sooner or later they will say, stop it. Enough.
Because when you have on one hand intensive, well-organized propaganda, you know, who repeats and repeats the same thing, and you are sitting passively instead of developing your own propaganda, and I say propaganda can be a very good word, is the things which you try to explain are good things. So propaganda of freedom and democracy is good.
Let's put it this way, because it's pretty simple. The late Andrew Breitbart, who was a good friend of mine, said one thing: politics is downstream of culture. And he was 100% correct. By the time you get to the age of voting, your mind has already been filled up with right and wrong and this and that, so many other things that you're not seeing straight. And especially given that the educational system has been permeated by the left as well. So there's nothing more important than seizing the culture. And you're not going to do it in a day because it's really hard. But you got to do it step by step, and if you don't, it's over.
I think the circumstances in America are going to force us out of our comfort zone. And then we're going to start looking for truth. And we'll find it in alternate media, we'll find it in the church, and we'll find it among our fellow Americans.
With all our being, we must reject Marxism, science, and disinformation that has been used so negatively to transform our world. Let us return to the American traditions of patriotism, honesty, and fairness. The United States of America is the greatest country on earth. We must preserve it that way for future generations. That is why I speak out.
Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
It has been many years since I escaped from that evil society known as the Soviet Empire and came to the United States, the land of my youthful dreams. Even today, it is still difficult for me to find adequate words to express my gratitude to the U.S. government for granting me political asylum. July 28th, 1989 was the most important benchmark in my new life. On that day, I became an American citizen. I paid with 2 death sentences and multiple attempts to kill me for the privilege of becoming a citizen of this unique land of freedom. And I believe it is my duty to help it avoid the Marxist curse.
In a letter from the CIA, he was credited as the only person in the Western world who had single-handedly demolished an entire enemy espionage service.
You have made an important and unique contribution to the United States, of which you can justly be proud. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure on this momentous and solemn occasion to wish you happiness and fulfillment in this country as a U.S. citizen.
On July 7th, 1999, Romania's Supreme Court canceled Pacepa's death sentences, yet Romania's government refused to comply, and it still treats him like a traitor.
Romania is a marvelous country, which once had the misfortune of falling under the spell of Marxism and disinformation. I love my native country. I treasure my first 50 years of life there, my relatives, my good friends, and the graves of my parents. I started my life over at the age of 50 in order to help Romania's courageous people rid themselves of one of the most disgusting tyrants history has ever known. I felt a strong obligation to do so. With all my heart, I wanted to see Romania re-enter the democratic world to which it once belonged.
Even though the serialization of Red Horizons by Radio Free Europe in 1989 played an incontestable role in overthrowing Ceausescu, a new Romanian generation has started believing the egomaniacal dictator was actually a national hero. Now, Lieutenant General Pacepa has become the victim of disinformation and is portrayed as a man who betrayed his boss at the direction of the KGB and the CIA. Once again, the black art of framing comes to life. But from those that know him and speak of him, he is greatly admired for who he is, for what he has done with his life, for what he has done for his native Romania, and for what he has done for the United States. Ion Mihai Pacepa broke with the system for moral reasons and courageously exposed its terrorist underpinnings. He has proven to be a formidable witness and a respected analyst of the communist intrigues, schemes, and manipulations that still threaten our world. Today, we need more Pacepas to step forward, to bring light into the darkness.